hybrid events, I'm sure you'll agree, remain one of the most challenging. So I will do my best. It's lovely to see you all. My name is Rachel Wolfe. I'm founding partner of the consultancy Public First. You may have heard a little about our polling this morning. Our polling on AI, for what it's worth, does show that disinformation, which is the topic we'll be discussing today, is the one that the public spontaneously raise when you ask them about AI and its risks. It's definitely already on their radar. What we'll talk about today is how worried they should all be and what we might want to do about it. Because I'm standing between you and lunch, I'm going to be very on time. We've only got about 35 minutes. So I'm going to ask the panelists 2 questions in turn. I'm first going to ask each of them to tell us a little bit about how big an issue this is today and how much it's likely to intensify over the next year. I'm sure you have all heard this is a big election year. And then I'm going to ask them again what they think governments, regulators, others should do about it. I'll then open up to questions. Please make them questions. I will have to chair reasonably tightly, but I'm very much looking forward to seeing what you all want to explore. But before I do that, let me introduce my panel. So from left to on the screen on my right, Henry Ajder, who is a generative AI expert and broadcaster. He's well known for his expertise on this question and generative AI more broadly, and he advises organizations including Adobe, Meta, the European Commission, BBC, the Partnership on AI, and the House of Lords. Given the case study the Palace has kindly provided us with this morning, we might talk about Adobe in a minute. Next to my left is Henry Parker, Global Head of Government Affairs at Logically.a. It's a UK tech scale-up that combines advanced AI with one of the world's largest commercial fact-checking and open source intelligence teams, and works with governments, businesses, and social media platforms to identify harmful mis- and disinformation online. Me to my right is John, who I don't think I've seen since the 2019 election campaign. It's been a while. John is an MP and former minister. He's MP for Weston-super-Mare. He recently hosted a Westminster Hall debate on preventing misinformation and disinformation in online filter bubbles, and as I'm sure he'll discuss, he tried but didn't quite manage to get some amendments on this into the gargantuan Online Safety Act. And last but not least, joining us online is Dorka, who's a research fellow for the Centre for Euro-Atlantic Integration and Democracy. She is also a visiting fellow with the Engaging Central Europe programme of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and she pursues her PhD at the Corvinus University of Budapest, researching Russian domestic disinformation about the West. I'm sure all of us are wondering exactly what Russia is likely to be up to this year. So, immediately diving into my first question and starting with you, Henry, what is already happening and what's likely to happen this year?
So what's already happening is something that's kind of been anticipated for a long time, and then it's kind of come all at once in a sense. So been working on this topic since 2017. Every single midterm or presidential election, particularly in the US, I've been asked by journalists, by politicians and the like, is this going to be the one where deepfakes and generative content are going to kind of cause chaos, undermine elections, swing either kind of votes of specific candidates or the entire presidential election? And up until recently, it's not been particularly plausible. We've seen a few narrow cases of, let's say, an image of a non-existent person being used on a profile that released the Hunter Biden dossier, for example. Or we saw the case of a couple of deepfake videos being used in kind of satirical political campaigns, but the impact was very minimal. Over the last kind of 18 months, 2 years, we've seen a rapid democratization of increasingly sophisticated AI tools, whether that's for voice audio generation, whether that's image generation, video generation, or indeed, of course, text. And the results have been a truly global shift in the disinformation landscape in terms of the sophistication of the kinds of content that people are creating as an extension of what was already being done, kind of from cheap fakes to deep fakes, kind of crude manipulation to more sophisticated manipulation. And we've also seen increasing impact as a result of that. So people being more frequently deceived, politicians being increasingly concerned. I'm sure many of the people in this room heard about the Sadiq Khan case that happened last year around Armistice Day. So this kind of change in the landscape of the accessibility of the tools at the same time that they've become more realistic in their outputs and more efficient in the way that they run has led to a completely changed landscape across the world. So whether that was in India, where we saw BJP using this to speak several different languages via their politicians, which they then kind of decried and disowned, which was then done by Eric Adams, Mayor of New York, when reaching out to voters as well. Whether that was in Argentina last year, where we saw both politicians kind of releasing AI-generated images of each other, kind of as crazy lunatics, but also aggrandizing themselves as kind of strongmen superheroes. Whether that was in Indonesia a couple of weeks ago, where we saw synthetic resurrection of a deceased politician endorsing the candidate that went on to win. Or indeed in Slovakia, where we saw the losing candidate targeted by deepfake on the eve of the election, saying he was going to rig the election. It went viral. Correlation is not causation. We don't know exactly how much of an impact it had, but he certainly seemed to think it had some. So this is now a global challenge. It is here. The question is no longer if it will happen, it's how impactful it will be.
Henry, is that also your experience? And how impactful do you think it might be in the next year?
I think broadly it is, actually. I mean, I think the first thing to really understand here is disinformation isn't new. There has been disinformation impacting elections online and electoral process for at least the last 10 years. I mean, there are documented cases during the Scottish referendum, for example. And the government actually announced that there are efforts to amplify disinformation during the 2019 election in the UK too. And then you have the granddaddy of electoral disinformation, which is the Russian attempts to interfere in the US presidential election in 2016. So I think the point I would get across is none of this is really new. What's being inserted into this, to Henry's point, is a catalyst for it to become much more wide scale and for a change in nature to it. And I think he already pointed to the idea of what we call flooding the zone, which is the idea that because you have lowering barriers for entry to produce fake content, you have the ability to pump so much disinformation around a given electoral event into the information environment, you just cause an overarching sense of distrust to emerge in that information environment, so that people start to lose respect for and trust for the electoral process they're about to participate in. I think that really is what we see starting to manifest itself. This idea that you can insert images, insert multimedia voice or video at crucial moments, what we call sort of black swan events, to just cause people to really question the veracity of what they're going to be looking at. And I mean, they don't actually have to be that good, to be honest. Quality doesn't really matter in this. It's them appearing at the right time, in the right volume, and then being amplified by the right people to make sure that they land and they cause that impact. I think moving forward, what we haven't yet started to see, but we think is on the horizon, is probably the use of generative AI to much more effectively micro-target these messages to people who are prepared to listen. So the use of generative AI to actually micro-target disinformation to specific audiences, and the use of it to, I guess, farm the personal characteristics of people online, so you can actually target those messages very effectively and quickly to people you know are going to listen. Haven't quite seen that yet. Specific examples, actually I was going to say Slovakia and Argentina as well. We worked on both elections. We had teams working in Slovakia, and we actually identified, and we put this in the public domain, very specific campaigns that were ongoing in Argentina, which didn't actually use generative AI, but were designed to use disinformation on social media to make people lose faith in the process. And just a quick plug, we published a paper on all of this today. You can find it on Logically.a right now, where we've gone through exactly how we think this will manifest in a bit more detail. So I'd urge you to read that.
So can I just push on one thing quickly, Henry? So you mentioned micro-targeting, and that immediately made me think of vaccine hesitancy, where there was obviously quite effective information at small groups of people who didn't take up vaccines, none of which, to my knowledge, used generative AI and was extremely effective without it. So is this just a scale thing? There's just going to be a lot more of it? Or is there a severity here for these groups that didn't exist before?
I'd argue it's both. Scale, definitely. But what I mean, okay, let's just think how I'm going to get slightly technical about how disinformation works here. But in previous campaigns we've seen around disinformation, generally the actors have designed those campaigns by inference about that person. So, for example, if it's on Facebook, who their friends are, what groups they're in. What we're talking about now is micro-targeting by, for example, their actual posts or what they like. That allows a whole new level of understanding about that person, and it actually enables you to far more effectively target that message at that particular person.
Because AI itself can absorb that material.
Yes, exactly. And that is what we're on the cusp of at the moment. And I think what that means is that you start to get into this question of personalising micro-targeting. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether any of this matters for elections at all. I mean, do campaigns even work? Some people say they don't. Some people say they do. Now, what does work in campaigning is knowing your target. And the more effectively you can know your target, the more effectively you can target your message. Yeah. And this just allows a whole new ability to do that wasn't previously there. If we talk about what the chief risk that we've elaborated on our paper on this, I would say that probably is it.
Brilliant. By the way, my favourite example of old school disinformation is when Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, was accused of selling votes for kisses in the 19th century, and I very strongly recommend you look at the cartoons. It's a really good example of how long this has been around. But John, how much do you see this already, if at all, as an MP? And do you think your colleagues in either party would have the faintest idea what to do if it did happen?
The answer, I'm afraid, is it's very much a minority pursuit in the building over the road from where we are now. But you're right, this is misinformation, disinformation has been around since the Zinoviev letter and all these other things going back for decades and centuries. The difference now is AI means you can get really good at it and really large scale at it, and it's much, much harder to spot, and it's much more, therefore, easier to do, and there are fewer gatekeepers currently in place to stop it. So the scale is huge, and you're also right to say it isn't just politics. I mean, we're talking about this because it's an election year and the effect on our democracy is core to our society. But yeah, health information, really, really key. We've seen that already happening, and there are many other walks of life too. You can destroy companies and jobs and investment very fast using this stuff as well. So it is incredibly dangerous. It is, as I said, not something which most MPs, I think, have really clocked onto yet. And that's largely because, as you rightly pointed out in your introduction, the Online Safety Act, as it now is enormous and does all sorts of very, very important things. And that's kind of given, certainly the body politic, I think, in this country, a sense, firstly, of indigestion, because we've been dealing with trying to protect children online and other very important things. It does some really good and vital things. And also a sense of sort of, right, you know, we can push that one to the back of the pile of things to do for a while. And I'm afraid that's not right. And so at the moment, there's an awful lot of, it hasn't happened yet, so therefore I don't need to worry about it yet. But it is happening. I completely agree with both Henrys. And it's going to get an awful lot worse. And it's going to get an awful lot worse really fast because it's just becoming possible for it to get an awful lot worse and get an awful lot more effective right now. Just as a final thought, the most effective thing which I think would persuade an awful lot of other MPs, I got sent something on WhatsApp by a campaigner in this space, and she had spent 10 minutes doing a deepfake of me in the Houses of Parliament. And it was an unthreatening topic, and she's saying, "Hi, John, this is a woman I know. I'm making you say things just to show what can be done. This took me less than 10 minutes. Now, if you send one of those to most MPs, my God, you get our attention really fast. But at the moment, we're miles and miles and miles away from that.
I have a strong suspicion that's now going to happen within 2 days.
Please, go.
Dorka, do you feel free to respond to what others have said? But I think we all would love to know what Russia is up to and what it is likely to be up to in the next year. So how do you see things developing?
Well, I'm glad to see that we are on the same page with the previous panelists. So I also do agree on the fact that deepfakes are basically nothing new in a sense of the functioning and of the essence how disinformation works. It basically just makes disinformation go on steroids, because disinformation itself is not the core problem, but it is something that third parties, especially parties interested in various other things, therefore malign actors such as Russia, are keen on using. So, for instance, I'm thinking about that disinformation is really not the core. Eventually, it is something to be amplified. There are cracks in every single society, between every single group eventually, and disinformation is just something that they can push in those cracks and can exploit these and increase polarization, making our societies way less cohesive and therefore way less effective and efficient in responding to external challenges. And this is exactly what malign actors such as Russia is exploiting. So what I'm expecting here is that basically we are going to see very similar things, in many cases, emotional triggers, because whenever we are facing emotional triggers, we tend to act absolutely illogically. So what this disinformation often is trying to make us do is to provoke us to do or engage in a predictable but illogical behavior. And disinformation, also in the form of deepfakes, is just a perfect example for doing that. So what I'm expecting this election year is that, yes, deepfakes are definitely here. And unfortunately, I think they are here to stay with us. Especially Russia's war in Ukraine is an extremely fertile soil for deepfakes also on this. And eventually economic turmoil are something to be exploited. However, I would also like to warn for the danger that there is this narrative surrounding deepfakes, because obviously we are all quite afraid of what might happen, and it might simply make certain shifts in our public perception as well. So it might make that we are maybe more afraid of deepfakes than the danger they actually pose to us. But also there might be such a thing as the liar's dividend, which might be also a tool for political manipulation. So it means that for certain individuals who are actually aware that these political and realistic fakes are around, they might just claim deepfakery to basically anything. So I think that this is also potentially a big danger.
So if you were Putin and you were looking at the British, or more plausibly the American election, how are you likely to wish to provoke these illogical emotional actions? What kind of specifically are you trying to do? And is there anything that the American or British government and regulators could credibly do to stop it?
Oh, indeed. So I would definitely go for emotional triggers if I were to use deepfakes. And well, as mentioned, micro-targeting has become, and this is becoming tremendously more efficient and also cheap as time passes and progresses. So as these malicious actors are going to be increasingly able to sense those threats and sense those trigger points in societies and in those groups, I would aim for those cyber and connector. And well, there's a lot to do. But for instance, the international cooperation between parties, between countries, and between countries and tech companies is impossible, unfortunately, because we are basically going to suffer from the same technology sooner or later. And if we are not there to share our expertise, to share any potential solutions, basically we are going to reinvent this firm border every single time when we try to face this issue alone.
Thank you. And John, let's say you were dictator for the day.
It's not scary at all. Go on.
What would you pass or do to reduce the risk, if you think that's possible, of destabilizing disinformation and deepfakes?
So I don't claim to have the entire answer, but I had a couple of goes in the to table some amendments to the Online Safety Act when it's going through Parliament. I think there are two things we need to worry about in broad terms. One is stuff which is just factually inaccurate. And there's quite a lot you can do, but I think I recognise that the technical solutions are not perfect yet for spotting provenance, so you can see where something came from, who's altered it on the way, and so therefore you can start to work out whether or not it's likely to be true. It's also possible you might want to start in the same way as we have trust scores for people who you transact with on eBay and everything else. You might also want to say how likely is it that Penrose routinely tells fibs and or tells the truth, and you could sort of start to develop a good reputation that way. Dangerous though, you've got to be very careful about how that's done. That could be badly misused. And then the other thing is we already have some things in the analog world for broadcasters. We've had for years and years and years something called the duty of truth and duty of balance and undue prominence, which basically says if you're listening to the news on BBC, radio or TV, or Sky or wherever it might be, if someone's putting one side of the argument, they've got to put the other side as well. That doesn't apply online to your filter bubble and mine. In fact, it works in the opposite direction. You get fed more and more of whatever it is you've chosen, and that means you can rapidly head down radicalizing or echo chamber type rabbit holes. And I think that perhaps trying to find some way of creating a digital online version of that existing tried and tested, rather effective, old economy, old tech duty of balance and undue prominence for the filter bubbles might be a really, really effective way of trying to reforge the consensus rather than pushing everybody to extremes. So those would be my two starting points, maybe 2.5 starting points. I'm not sure that's the full answer, and there's an awful lot of really clever technical people in this room who can probably improve on that, but that would, I think, get us going at least.
Do feel free to disagree with previous speakers if you think any of this won't work. But Henry, what would you do? Henry Parker's right. I'm not used to two Henrys. I've never had
This is my first two Henry.
Firstly, I just want to agree with Dorka actually a little bit about the Russian the tactics that Russia might use. I mean, we've been tracking Russian disinformation for many years. We publish, again, all the stuff that we understand about how Russia does information on our website. You can look at it. They very much do focus on societal polarization. What they're not doing is like trying to get you to change your vote, okay? You won't see Russian disinformation saying, we hate the Tories, or we hate Labour, just to be equal-handed. You'll see them... Choose your balance. Right? Yeah, choose your balance right now. What you will see is them trying to play on people's emotions. They try to amplify people's existing mistrusts in institutions, people's existing skepticism of the information environment they operate in, and they see that as a weapon. And it is a weapon. I mean, one of the key things we have in our democracy is the idea that we have faith in it. And if you lose faith in it, you're actually using that as an effective weapon against a nation state that you, for whatever reason, don't like. Right. So I do want to just emphasize that is what he, I won't say they, or whoever is doing it, is trying to achieve.
And then rapidly give me a couple of points.
A couple of points. I would say the UK government has got the powers it needs to deal specifically with the Russian problem. What we see this problem as dealing with is far more than like, can we look at whether every image is fake or not. We see it as a behavioural problem. There are certain online behaviours that are characteristic of someone operating a disinformation campaign. The Online Safety Act creates the powers for Ofcom to set out what those behaviours are and require platforms to have whatever means they've got to look for those platforms, those behaviours, identify them, and where possible, remove the content if they can infer that a disinformation campaign is happening. So it's really in the gift of Ofcom and the government to codify what it is meant by that legal power that's given to them in the Online Safety Act and actually put a realistic programme for countering this problem into regulation. The bill is passed. They've got the powers to do it. And what they need to do is be clear about what they think good looks like in this space. And I'm sure everybody, both the regulated and the safety tech industry, such as ourselves, would like to see that. I think the other final thing I would just end with is the government has positioned their digital imprints regime as a key sort of safeguard against this issue, which has came in in November 2023. What's interesting is that although John will have to put an imprint on all his material as a candidate, and his agents will, unpaid for, organic content, which is exactly the type of content that Russia might try to pass off as legitimate in a campaign, doesn't have to have an imprint put on it. Now, that to us, and we can debate the reasons why, seems a significant loophole in what the primary measure that government have put forward as being safeguard against this risk is. So there are simple things that could be done. No new legislation is needed. We just need to get on and implement what's already there.
Thank you. Henry, you get the last word before I go to questions.
I just want to very, very quickly say responses to deepfakes technical approaches. I think that's really important. There's a lot of talk right now about detection, watermarking. These are vague terms. People don't really understand what they mean. Detection using AI to fight AI, my humble opinion, not reliable at scale. It's not robust. It's something which, even if you have 99% success rate, sounds good. The amount of the volume of content being published online is so huge. That's still a lot of false positives, false negatives.
And we've seen kids being falsely accused of cheating from AI.
Exactly, with plagiarism detectors in schools, but we've also seen this in the context of the Gaza-Israel crisis. We've seen this in the context of the Miami's coup that's ongoing. Detection at scale is a really challenging proposition. It's not that it doesn't have a role, but it needs to be used by informed individuals. Without that, it muddies the water further, and people have an unrealistic expectation of how reliable it is. You can have watermarking. Watermarking is describes in the image, right? So this is signals that are injected into the media itself. This is something that has some promise, but that also can be removed. So you can compress an image very heavily to basically make the watermarks indetectable or actively remove them. Challenging to do at scale again, more promising I think than detection, but still has big challenges. Then we have kind of, I guess, what we could call provenance authentication, which is attaching metadata which is not in the image but attached to the image, cryptographically securing that, a bit like a nutrition label as you get on food. It tells you how it's been made, how it's been edited, transparency about it. That to me is the most technically promising. It's also the most socially challenging because that requires an entire societal shift about our reflexive response to how we think about media. Instead of seeing is believing and hearing is believing, you look for that kind of cryptographically hashed data and say, okay, there's that tick, there's that content credential, I trust it. But that's going to require all of the platforms, governments, service providers, AI tool providers to buy into it, and that's really challenging.
Thank you. Okay, we are open for questions. I think I have time for 2 rounds of questions if they are shortish questions. The lady there on the right, the lady in white, and the lady in black at the front. The lady there was first, and you.
Hi, Casey Callista from Labor Digital. A lot of the solutions that you talked about were after the content has already been proliferated. A lot of recent studies have said that even once people are told that it is false information, they believe it if it agrees with their worldview or if it reinforces their existing worldview. So what do we do about that?
Thank you. And then the lady in white.
I think my question is going to build nicely. So I'm from PwC, I work in policy and regulations. And basically I'm interested about the data governance because as it was said, once the data is collected, it is there for the reinterpretation. Do you think that maybe we need to take a step back and think how the big tech corporation collect our data? Because it's not just behavioral data, it's becoming much more of the health gold rush. So we allowed all the data from the biometrics to be then taken and used as seen fit. And what can we do there to prevent that?
And then the lady in black in the front row. I'm delighted that the first 3 questions were from women, by the way. That's never happened to me before.
Hi. We talk a lot about it's already happened and then dealing with it, so almost in a reactive way, but I was just thinking about from the cyber perspective, your thoughts on that, as in it's a critical enabling technology and so it should go hand in hand, if not further forward than developments in AI and other tech innovation. Cyber sort of from a perspective of defending against innovation, but also utilising it to increase cyber resilience. And believe me, I tie myself up in knots with all of those thoughts and discussions at work, but very interested in your comments.
So I think all of those questions were about why are we so downstream and how do we get further upstream? Don't feel you have to answer to all of them, but I'll come to each of you in turn on whatever you think most interesting. Dorka, I'll start with you. Can you hear me? Did you hear the questions? Did you hear the questions? No? Okay. I'll come back to you for closing remarks then, I apologise. John, do you want to reflect on the questions?
Yeah, so I agree with you that the problem of being too downstream is that the damage can already be done by the time any kind of fact checkers or anything else catches up. And so therefore, I think, yes, we need to get upstream. I think it is better if we can create the right kind of water for you and I's fish to swim in, to make sure that it is likely to be cleaner at least. And that means there's all sorts of things to do with presets and toggles and bits and pieces about what you want to see. They have to be, obviously, I would argue, set by you and me as individuals. But if we say, look, I don't want to see stuff that's been altered by in the following ways, or I don't want to see stuff which is only one-sided, then at that point you can get to the point where you have an online information environment which is closer to what used to be the analog world, which was far from perfect, but was didn't face these challenges, where there were proper gatekeepers for quite a lot of it, at least. And I think creating those gatekeeper upstream moments and gateways is absolutely essential. I think we can do that, but it will require, again, quite a lot of change and quite a lot of duties being placed on big tech platforms in particular in order to install those gateways properly.
You don't have to reflect this in your comments, but I'm interested in the emphasis we're putting on the guardians and the gateways, given there's quite a lot of controversy about our existing guardians and gateways. There's been a huge debate about BBC Verify in the last week and whether it's really objective or not. That humans are not always considered invaluable or unbiased as these gateways. So I don't know how effective the counter they are. But I'll go to Henry Ajder first, and I'll come to you last on any of the points raised.
Sure. So the idea of having, let's say, filters or some kind of protections further upstream is one that is obviously desirable, but there's also a reason why I think that there hasn't been much of that implemented thus far. It comes back to this idea again of, if you're talking about hyper-realistic synthetic content, deepfakes and the like, we know, again, detection is not reliable at scale. And these tools are evolving all of the time, so even if they're reliable now, in 6 months' time, they may not be unless they're continually updated. It's what we call an adversarial dynamic, right? Social media companies, their content moderation teams struggle with the content that they already have, right? A lot of that, most of that comes online and is reactively taken down. So to think that with more sophisticated, harder to spot forms of AI-generated content is going to be easier without then catching a huge amount of collateral is, I think, unfortunately naive to suggest that that can be done easily. Social media companies have not invested to the level that they need to tackle this problem seriously, in my view. And they're not going to suddenly invest even more, I feel, into these kinds of automated capacities. I think it's the kind of the likes of Logically folks who are doing some really interesting work, right, on trying to catch this and trying to,
Beautiful segue.
That
was great.
Try and give him...
Henry, are you the answer to all our problems?
Well, I was really pleased to get 3 questions that allow me to explain that we've designed an entire company to solve the 3 questions that you've all highlighted, because that's exactly what we're here to do. So just to explain what we are doing and how we're trying to make a business out of essentially trying to be one of these guardians, which you're quite right is a very difficult political place to be. Just Google a certain Twitter Files journalist and his write-up of us recently. I'll put it on the table as to what some people think of what we're trying to do. But we are trying to actually insert ourselves as a technology firm and a fact checker into this. So we already work with Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok to do fact checks. You can see our work next to viral posts already in the UK and all around the world. What we are trying to do is actually use technology to deal with this problem of scale. So we are actually trying to use AI as a safety tool, both to allow fact checkers, for example, to deal with the huge volume of new content coming in. We can use AI not to tell the truth. AI can't do that yet, but it can triage doubtful content and prioritize what to be checked. The key thing we see is how you can use technology to actually identify, and I talked about this earlier, the behavioral patterns around disinformation campaigns. So to Henry's point, what we're deploying into the market at the moment is the type of tools that allow someone that does open source intelligence. If you don't know what that is, think Bell and Cat. We basically do what they do, but use it in a different way. And allow them to take maybe sources of, say, 30 social media platforms, thousands and millions of data points, and very quickly see, am I looking at a disinformation campaign, or am I looking at a bunch of Taylor Swift fans who are just swapping information about tickets? Because the behavioral patterns around how social media can interact can be quite similar, and you have to be able to make those judgments. So what we are trying to do, I guess, is actually deal with the problem of upstream by mitigating the amount of time that this content is in front of people. Because in our view, the amount of harm it causes is proportionate to how viral it goes and how many people see it. So you can intervene using technology to try and help the platforms, which is what we're trying to do, manage that problem quickly using the type of philosophy around cybersecurity. That's exactly how the cybersecurity industry grew up. We're not a cybersecurity company. What we're trying to do is systematize the idea that you can manage disinformation online and how it manifests itself so that you can reduce the harm. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I've got time for one more round of questions. Dorka, I hope you hear some of these, but I'll come to you for closing remarks regardless. Any other questions? So we have 2 ladies in the middle, and just for once, let's have a man. Why not? And the gentleman on the second row from the front there.
Hi, my name's Val. I run a tech company. I'm really pleased to hear that taking your points that we seem to be in a good place and we've got good people looking after our interests. I'm wondering if all the learnings that we're making, is that going to make its way back into education? And, you know,
Good question.
particularly in our tech education, I think that's going to be so important.
Thank you. And can you pass straight to the lady behind you?
Thank you. Kat Sommer, NCC Group. I'd just be interested in a brief critique of the AI election accord that was signed at the Munich Security Conference in terms of content and likely effectiveness.
Great question. And then the gentleman at the front.
Hi, Nathan Brown from Autodesk, an American software company. In terms of, there's a point been made around education, but in terms of actually setting out how audiences interact with misinformation, couldn't an approach be that major political parties almost set the rules of engagement, as in to say, you know, if it doesn't come from this source, no matter who it is, don't believe it, essentially? And what's that kind of inter-party dialogue, and what does that look like?
Great questions. Dorka, did you hear any of those?
I hope I did. So
Wonderful.
Yep.
If I can ask
So
you
I
to
heard
give...
some part. I hope I heard it correctly.
Well, I'm sure I'll be interested. If you could give very brief answers as your closing remarks, because we are almost at lunch, I would be super grateful.
All right, so related to the education related question. So indeed, we have to keep it in mind, and not only with regard to deepfakes, but it might also be tremendously useful with this kind of disinformation. So we have to probably focus on, when we are educating youngsters, or for that any age group, for instance, the logical fallacies and argumenting mistakes that certain disinformation and the deepfake content may use. And also we have to warn people, for instance, for emotionally loaded content, whatever that might be, so that those would raise some eyebrows that, well, I should be probably careful looking at it, whatever it is. Probably I should double check, verify before sharing it. And as for preliminaries on my end, needless to say, we have to invest more in softwares, also detection softwares, but for instance, we need to do something with the detrimental impact of the layoff of many employees who were responsible for content moderation of social media platforms, because, for example, this really is a big problem with small languages. I'm from Hungary, so I'm especially receptive to this problem. At MENA, we have one single person responsible for Hungarian language moderation, which probably you might know about. The Hungarian disinformation sphere is less than enough. And I'm sure that Hungary is not the only place where this is a problem. Therefore, even though we have to rely on AI, we have to rely on technology, but this is actually not enough, unfortunately.
Thank you. John, very briefly, as you're closing, can MPs just set the rules of engagement?
Sadly, no, perhaps actually from a democratic point of view, blessedly no. So we can make sure that elections are, you know, as free and fair as possible. But as we've heard earlier on, I think from both Henrys as well, you know, the people who are producing some of this stuff aren't covered by the need to put any kind of a watermark or any sort of, you know, printed and published by tag on what they're producing. So even if, in the, I fear, unlikely event that the Labour and the Conservative parties and the SNP and everybody else behaved absolutely beautifully during the next election, there are plenty of people out there who wouldn't be covered by that, who have malign intent and who would not behave well at all. So while it might help, I'm sure it would, it would be very far from a proper solution. I think actually, to go back to the first question in particular, this point about education is absolutely essential. It's essential partly because it's the one bit of my amendments that we did manage to get into the Online Safety Act, so there is some legislative backbone for this. It's not huge, but it's certainly better than nothing, and it does mean that there is an opportunity to teach people about what to look out for, and then to equip them with the online tools in order to precept what they see or to make intelligent choices. And that's going to be a moving target because, you know, this is a moving target because it's a battle between the malign and the beneficial. So you can't just do a one-off. It's something where we're going to have to continually educate ourselves throughout our lives about what the latest threats are, so we know how to spot them.
Thank you. Henry Parker, got about 90 seconds. I
Okay.
hope one of you will mention
Okay,
Munich.
firstly, education, incredibly important. We do design media literacy solutions as well. We did one with TikTok during the local elections in 2023. which enable people to, when they search for election terms and election videos, to be given authoritative content or hints towards where they could find authoritative content and fact checks around things. I think it's really important that they do that. On the election accord, very much welcome it. The provenance emphasis was great, but I go back to my original point. This is both a provenance problem and a dissemination problem. So the accord was very good on how we can use content provenance to solve this problem. It didn't have much to say about what platforms should and should not be doing in the context of that content getting out into the wild, managing it and making sure it doesn't cause harm. There are proactive solutions. There's technology. We've got it. That can help with this. We really would welcome some discussion about that in any international accord as well.
I don't think we're in a good place. Sorry. I don't think we're in a good place. I think the technology is moving incredibly fast. This idea that we can educate ourselves out of this, I don't think is feasible. The human eye and ear are no longer reliable guides, nor are the detection tools. Provenance is the best way forward. It's also the hardest to implement. I'm not saying that to be dystopian or a doomer. I think it's more to motivate the fact that we cannot be complacent and that we need a huge amount more work on this, and we need stakeholders aligned and treating this urgently in a way I wish they had done 5 years ago, and they didn't. We're now playing catch up. We've got to start running faster.
I was trying to be positive.
On that
Sorry.
call to action.
Sorry.
Thank you to all of my brilliant panelists. Dorka, thank you for bearing with the 19th century building meets 21st century technology. Thank you for being such an engaged audience, and enjoy lunch.
Thank you.
Cheers.